We all know about the transatlantic slave trade, the forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas. It is a chapter in history that has been extensively studied, discussed, and remembered. But what if I told you that long before Africans were shackled in chains and transported across the Atlantic, another group of people had already suffered a similar fate? What if I told you that Native Americans, the original inhabitants of the very land that European colonizers set foot on, were among the first to be captured, enslaved, and sold as property? This is a history that has been buried under centuries of silence. A history of betrayal, survival, and resilience. The enslavement of Native Americans was not just an isolated occurrence. It was an extensive, systematic practice that spanned multiple continents and shaped the trajectory of entire nations. Yet, it remains one of the most overlooked aspects of colonial history. Today, we uncover this forgotten slave trade, a slave trade that began long before the first Africans arrived in bondage. This is not just a minor footnote in history books. The practice of enslaving Native Americans was widespread, affecting countless tribes, displacing entire communities, and leading to long-term cultural destruction. It was a practice that altered the balance of power in the Americas, fueling violent conflicts between indigenous nations and European settlers while laying the groundwork for future systems of oppression. The scars of this dark period still linger today, deeply embedded in the history of Native American communities. But why is it that so few people know about this? Why has this brutal chapter been omitted from mainstream historical narratives? And, more importantly, how did it happen? Who was responsible? And in what ways did Native Americans resist their enslavement? To understand the origins of Native American slavery, we must go back to the very beginning of European colonization in the Americas. It all started in 1492 when Christopher Columbus, an ambitious explorer under the sponsorship of Spain, set foot on the shores of the Caribbean. His arrival marked the beginning of a new era, one that would bring immense suffering to the indigenous peoples of the New World. Columbus did not merely observe the people he encountered, he saw them as resources. In his journals, he described the native inhabitants as intelligent, physically strong, and capable of hard labor. But more importantly, he saw them as potential servants. In his own words, he wrote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And Columbus wasted no time in acting upon this thought. On his very first voyage back to Spain, he took native captives, some as gifts for the Spanish monarchy, others to be sold into slavery. This marked the beginning of the Native American slave trade, a practice that would soon expand rapidly across the Americas. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean were the first to experience this brutality firsthand. Thousands were captured and forced into labor, working under extreme conditions that led to mass deaths from overwork, malnutrition, and disease. What many people don't realize is that before African slavery became dominant, the Spanish, Portuguese, French, and British all enslaved Native Americans on a large scale. Over the next century, tens of thousands of indigenous men, women, and even children were forcibly taken from their homelands, torn away from their families, and subjected to grueling labor under the rule of European colonizers. By the early 1500s, the Spanish had fully institutionalized the practice, turning native slavery into a key part of their colonial economy. In territories such as Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, indigenous people were forced to work in mines, extracting gold and silver that would enrich the Spanish Empire. Many were also taken into domestic servitude, where they labored as cooks, maids, and household attendants for Spanish families. But the Spanish were not the only ones who engaged in this practice. The British and the French quickly followed suit, expanding the slave trade into North America. In the American South, English settlers established thriving native slave markets. Native Americans were captured and sold in exchange for European goods, guns, tools, and textiles, turning human lives into mere commodities. The demand for native slaves was so high that some indigenous groups were coerced into participating in the trade themselves, capturing members of rival tribes and selling them to European settlers in hopes of securing their own survival. But one of the most shocking aspects of this trade was the forced exportation of Native American slaves. Thousands of Native Americans were not kept within the Americas but were instead shipped off to distant lands. Many were transported to the Caribbean, where they were sold to plantation owners, forced to work in the brutal sugarcane fields. Others were taken even further across the Atlantic to Europe, where they disappeared from their homelands forever, absorbed into foreign slave markets. The conditions these indigenous slaves faced were horrific. They endured physical abuse, backbreaking labor, and extreme deprivation. Many were forced to work until their bodies could no longer endure the strain. Unlike African slaves, who were often enslaved for life, native slaves were frequently worked to death and then replaced with new captives. Their mortality rates were so high that European settlers eventually began to see their labor as unsustainable, leading to the shift toward the African slave trade. But the Native American people did not accept their enslavement without resistance. Across the continent, native tribes fought back. Some resisted through direct conflict, launching attacks against European settlements, destroying plantations, and killing slave traders. Others chose a more subtle form of defiance, running away from their captors, escaping into the wilderness, and forming hidden communities of free native peoples. In some cases, resistance took the form of legal battles. A few Native Americans were able to challenge their enslavement in colonial courts, arguing for their freedom on the basis of treaties and agreements that European powers had violated. In rare cases, they were successful. But for the vast majority, freedom remained an unreachable dream. By the late 18th century, native slavery began to decline. Many colonies passed laws banning the enslavement of Native Americans, and the focus of European slave traders shifted almost entirely to Africa. But the damage had already been done. Native populations had been decimated. Entire tribes had been displaced or destroyed. And even after native slavery officially ended, indigenous communities faced new forms of oppression, forced removals, cultural erasure, and systemic discrimination. Even today, the history of Native American slavery remains largely forgotten. Schools barely mention it. Most people are unaware that it ever happened. But this history is real, and its consequences still echo through generations of Native American families. But history must be remembered, not forgotten. The enslavement of Native Americans shaped the foundation of the Americas, and its impact is still visible in the struggles of indigenous communities today. So what do you think? Did you know about the Native American slave trade? How should we remember this history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We have a lot more hidden histories to uncover, so stay tuned for the next episode of Native Historian.